So welcome everybody to our second all-team expeditions meeting. For everyone, we're going to have some good student presentations today. First, we'll have Jacob Ritchie from Stanford.
Cool. So I'll just go ahead and share my screen here. So hi everybody, I'm Jacob. I'm, as Golda said, a first-year student at Stanford University, and I've been working with Michael Bernstein as a rotation student for the last 3 months, and this is the project that I've been helping out with as part of the group. This will be just sort of a high-level overview, so it may have duplicate information for Stephen and Madhav, but hopefully this will give everyone a sense of the data we've been collecting and hopefully give you ideas for how you might use it in your own parts of the project. So if you want, you can go right now to socialdistancing.stanford.edu, which is where we have links both to the data set and you can see how volunteers initially entered the data. What motivates our part of the project is that we need accurate data, not only on COVID-19 cases, but also on each of the non-pharmaceutical interventions that local, state, or national governments are imposing to try and determine the spread of the disease. What is important here are both what kind of non-pharmaceutical interventions are put in place and also the specific date when that happens. So to be able to match these policies to changes in case numbers, especially given the delay between when the government takes action and when we see that number reflected, this is very important. But especially in the United States, as most of you are probably aware, the response has been very fractured because a lot of the time the authority to put in place public health measures is at the municipal or county level. So my favorite example of this is that Nantucket, which is like a very small community on an island in Massachusetts that's only 10,000 people, actually had a shelter-in-place order before the rest of the state that was a bit more restrictive than the rest of the states that they later repealed. So if even communities of this size were at the beginning of the pandemic putting in place their own policies, there's just a lot of variation that we need to be able to capture in order to model this effectively. So there are a little over 3,000 counties or county level equivalents in the USA, and all of them potentially had different social distancing rules, different dates when they closed down different parts of their economy and reopened them. And there's currently no central repository of this information. That was true at the start of the project when the researchers at UVA contacted Michael. But it's also true right now. There are several other initiatives in parallel to ours that have also gathered partial non-pharmaceutical intervention information with county level resolution. But to our knowledge, there isn't a good resource for the entire country. And some of these, for example, the University of Georgia tried to collect good data on all of Georgia. And Keystone Strategy, which is a consulting firm that's been working with another group at Stanford, took the approach of trying to sample all of the counties by population that would be most important for modeling. For these different efforts, there's also the question of what county level policies would you actually be collecting. When we were developing our survey, we communicated with Madhav, Stephen, and Aqua, and their input was very important for selecting which measures we were going to try and track. So something like church closures was not something that we would have thought of if it hadn't been communicated to us that this is very important because this is an environment where people gather and mingle outside of the social networks they have, for example, at the office. And I think of these efforts, we're currently the only ones that are tracking religious gathering places. But that's also a bit more difficult because often these places closed of their own accord. So in general, it's just a very messy landscape, and we're doing our best to find data that will capture a lot of this variation. We consulted with the team at UVA and created a survey that could be done in 15 to 20 minutes. And the idea initially was that we were going to distribute this to volunteers, and they would be able to provide information both on what policies were in place in their county specifically and how well they and people they had seen were complying with these policies. So I can quickly show you this website, which we built. It shows all the data that we've gathered to kind of give volunteers an idea of what they'll be contributing to. And you can browse when each policy was put in place as well as the source, which is often a news article and can sometimes be a government executive order. So you can both look at the data on this website and as a volunteer you can contribute, and we're still receiving some volunteer contributions. So volunteer crowdsourcing to collect this data was the initial plan that Madhav had when he reached out to us. And we very quickly were able to turn around this website and launch it. And because I think a lot of people at the beginning of the pandemic were sitting at home without a feeling that they had any way to sort of contribute positively to resolving the situation or helping with the situation, we got a lot of interest at the start. We worked to promote it on social media and with Stanford's communications department. And after all of that, what we have is 13% of the US, so 425 counties, where we have the data either from our own team or from these volunteers who've used our website. And then we've gone through this verification workflow where either someone at Stanford or someone at UVA has gone in and checked every URL and every date to make sure that at least to a layperson, it seems reasonable. So the data will still have some errors, but it has at least not just come from a volunteer who's unvetted. It's been looked at by someone on our team, either at UVA or Stanford. And the data for these counties is available at this link, which I can send out in an email. But it basically has for all of these counties, those 6 measures of business closures, K-12 school closures, college and university closures, religious gathering closures, and shelter in place or lockdown orders. And because a lot of this data was gathered a few months ago at this point when we did our initial volunteer push, we don't currently have the reopening data using this workflow. We were able to gather data for a large number of counties, not near the 100% coverage. And one of the issues with this is that regions with low population density or regions where people are not reachable by our social networks that we are using to promote it, so there's a lot of empty spaces in the middle of the country, might not be reachable with this workflow of volunteer crowdsourcing. So the thing after about a month that we pivoted to was looking at Amazon Mechanical Turk, which is a paid crowdwork platform to possibly fill in these gaps. So we received a 10K grant from Amazon to gather this data. We used a subset of the questions from the survey I showed you earlier that the volunteer crowdsourcers went through. So we're only looking at the intervention aspect and no longer at compliance. The people answering this survey are people who do tasks on mTurk for a living often. And instead of being someone who resides in the specific county that we're interested in, we just enforce that they reside in the state so that they have a rough idea of the geography of the area they're gathering data for, but they don't necessarily have to be there on the ground. We're using a system that Michael and his group developed as part of a different research project called Fairwork, and this automatically bonuses Amazon Mechanical Turk workers so that they receive a prorated minimum of $15 an hour. So even if the task takes longer than we intended, based off their self-reports, we will adjust their wages to ensure that it's sort of up to this equitable minimum. So because this is a paid workflow instead of a volunteer workflow, there's a few advantages. We shied away in the volunteer workflow from requiring that volunteers provide a URL because we didn't want to dissuade people who lived in the county and remembered the date from giving us that information. But for the crowd workers, we can enforce that everyone provide a URL. We give them links to get started so they can quickly find one for each policy in the 6 categories. This verification workflow that we went through is quite labor intensive, so it's not possible to scale it up across the country. So what we're doing instead is we're aggregating 3 to 5 Amazon Mechanical Turk responses right now just by taking the median, and this allows us to estimate the date when each policy takes effect. What we started by doing is gathering complete data for 3 states, and we can compare both with the verified data and with data from other groups such as University of Georgia to get a sense of the error level in this data set. So we found 4 counties like Georgia that had a wide spread of county level policies being rolled out. We did better than a baseline of just using the statewide closure date, because often in this case, the counties would close earlier than the state because there was a large lag there. But for the other 2 states, we saw less dramatic improvements, and sometimes, for example, for school responses, this wasn't much better than the baseline anywhere. So we're still untangling where this is useful, what categories we can actually use the mTurk workflow to get high quality data for. And there's a few other considerations that you can look at this report to get an idea of, but hopefully we'll be scaling this up to the entire country in the next few weeks and then making the data available to everyone. Everything I've talked about before is just focusing on data for the initial closure. which is not the most critical for the policy questions that I understand people are dealing with right now. We're collecting the reopening data in a different way, because for reopening, a lot of the policies have been put in place by the state. And even if they're staggered by county, like counties have to meet a certain criteria to reopen, there's still a much lower number of places where we have to check. So the New York Times has data in this article that they update regularly showing the progress towards reopening. And we were able to extract the data file that's behind the visualizations, and it actually has more information than they expose in the article. So it has dates for each state of when specific categories of businesses opened. And it's a bit unstructured because the categories are kind of ad hoc, determined by the state governments, but all of that data is there, and it looks like we can continue to pull it as they update this article. So that's the state of the project at this moment. I wanted to acknowledge the people who helped us with this project. So Amazon for funding, the University of Georgia actually reached out to us and showed us their data, which has been quite useful in verifying our workflow. Tom Abate, who is an employee at Stanford, helped a lot with the initial push and gathering volunteers, and especially the people at UVA who've been helping us verify this information on top of their ordinary workloads. It's been very, very helpful, and we wouldn't have been able to do it without their support. So thanks, especially to Golda and Aaron who are on the call. And I realize I want to go back and just talk a bit about the people who've been involved sort of as the core people. So I've been helping organize the project and do some of the legwork, and Tom Chatrapurik, who is a recent PhD grad from Stanford, and Mark Whiting, who's a postdoc at UPenn, have been doing a ton of work as well. And also JD, who is a PhD student at Berkeley. And then Akla, Stephen, and Madhav have kind of been telling us what the goals of this whole project have been. That's where we are. Thanks a lot for your attention, and happy to take questions after.
Great talk, Jacob. Let others ask questions.
Hey, Jacob, this is Brian. I was just going to ask you real quick. You showed a distribution of the counties where you got that initial surge. You're calling it 13% because it is 400 counties, was pretty impressive. Any chance, you had a lot of California there. California ain't small. What percentage of the population might be an interesting metric to add there? And I'm guessing it's probably more like 20 or 30%.
Yeah, that's a very good point because, just the raw count of counties is probably not the best metric there. I don't have that data right now. I can tell you that a few of the counties that we have in California and Nevada are actually some of the lowest population density counties in the country. So like these ones right here, I'll get back to you with that. But
yeah, no worries. Just it seems like you got actually a pretty reasonable coverage of the population. You see Miami and Houston and New York and places like that. It's a lot, so it's good. Thanks.
And that's often where we did get those volunteer responses, is places that had large enough populations that there were a few people who would be able to see the survey.
So Jacob, thanks for the talk and also for mentioning, so I'm involved in that COVID-Biz project with Berkeley, where we are trying to collect interventions data as well. So there we adopted a more centralized approach, and there were some interesting data collection issues in terms of how you even ask experts. So we relied on experts to give us the reopening information. And so there were issues about how you design forms and how do you make sure that the data you collect is correct and so on. So I was just wondering, in your experience, so did you find that updating the data was critical, or at what granularity you were able to do that successfully, and at what granularity we are still not there yet? So in some sense.
Sorry, can you clarify a bit?
So for example, were you able to update the data every day or weekly? I mean, at what level should I trust the updates?
Yeah, so in general, we haven't been doing anything near that level of updating. So right now, our data is from whenever the volunteer response was entered. Because we're focusing on like the earliest possible closure date, it won't change too much. But yeah, it's meant to sort of give you an estimate of when the earliest thing was, instead of a time series of what's changed. I'd love to talk more about like the challenges you guys have run into, as I think your visualizations of it are quite interesting and useful. So yeah.
Thanks, Jacob. Yeah, sure, of course. And we'll be releasing a version of our reopening data, which might be useful in some sense. So yeah, thanks.
Right. Aditya, if there's a way to combine these efforts, it will be good at the end. I mean, there are two different ways of doing it, and perhaps they just cover different parts of the space. We can certainly have a chat. So the idea is really to make data that the world can use, or at least US can use in this case.
Exactly. No,
So,
you're right. I mean, I think, and the space is so chaotic, right? So
right.
different viewpoints are needed. Yeah.
Correct. So if there's a way to do this together, we are absolutely open. It was started when this whole thing became a really important question. In fact, Raman is also online. And Ramanan, I think at some point, if this is of interest and it will certainly be of interest in India and Africa, where the notion of reopening will be slightly different, you have a very good understanding of those regions. So if you think this is of interest, then maybe we can grow this project further. We just started this off with an intent of growing this eventually to worldwide intervention analysis itself. And I think Jacob has done an amazing job along with the team to collect the sources as well. I think in another year or so, when newspapers are not accessible, things are not accessible, this data, along with the source information, which will become very, very useful and handy as we study this retrospectively.
Yeah, that's another thing that I think we need to look into very soon is archiving of these sources, because a lot of these websites might change or become inaccessible. Especially a lot of the news organizations might put their stuff back behind a paywall as the pandemic progresses.
So thanks, Jacob, again. We can't clap. We'll have to do a virtual clap and a physical clap, but it's very good.
Our second presentation is from Lijing Wang today. She's at UVA, and she'll also be talking about some of her work on social distancing during this COVID-19 pandemic. So Lijing.
Okay, thank you, Goda. Thank you, Jacob. I'm Lijing Wang. I'm a PhD student from Computer Science Department of UVA and advised by MEDAF. So I'm very glad today to present our work of the interplay of global multi-scale human mobility, social distancing, government interventions, and COVID-19 dynamics. So this is a collaboration work between the UVA and Google. It's the most acute public health emergency since the 1918 influenza pandemic. And it has already infected almost 9 million people and resulted in about 500,000 deaths across the globe. Currently, the pharmaceutical interventions are not generally available, so the countries around the world have to rely on the behavioral interventions that involve some form of social distancing. The interventions such as the travel bans, the stay-at-home orders, the quarantine have dramatically changed human mobility in various ways. And inversely, that the changes in human mobility also affect COVID-19 dynamics in multiple ways. So here, our work is to quantify the impact of interventions to curtail mobility and social interactions in order to control the pandemic. We conduct the analysis using the Google COVID-19 aggregated mobility research dataset. So this dataset is anonymized mobility flows aggregated over users who have turned on the location history setting. And it provides a global time-varying anonymized mobility map of flows at a resolution of S2 cells. Here, the dataset is at weekly resolution. This is the overview of the multi-scales of the mobility, include the global scale, country scale, state scale, even the county or city scale. And besides the Google mobility dataset, we use the other two layers of data, include the COVID-19 surveillance data. This is come from the UVA COVID-19 surveillance dashboard and the social distancing guidelines in US states and India, which is the timeline of the government interventions. And mainly we use 4 kinds of metrics to do the analysis: the flow reduction rate, FRR, social distancing index, SDI, case count, growth rate, CGR, and the effective reproductive number, REFF. We conduct the counterfactual analysis on the timing of interventions using epidemic simulations. So we use a compartmental SER model to simulate and compare the impact of a delayed intervention. We will give the detailed analysis later. So the simulation will cover two kinds of scenario, the normal scenario and the weak delay in imposing intervention scenario. Here's the definition of some of the metrics. The flow reduction rate, FRR, quantifies the reduction in outflows compared to the baseline outflow. The baseline outflow here, we choose the average outflow during the pre-pandemic period. So a positive FRR means a flow increase, while the negative FRR means a flow reduction. And the social distancing index SDI quantifies the mixing or movement within a county. We consider the flows between the cells within a county and then compute the normalized flow matrix FT. Then we compare FT to the uniform matrix U and the identity matrix I and compute the SDI. So here, SDI value close to 1 indicates less or no mixing between cells, while the SDI value close to 0 indicates high level of mixing or movement between cells. And the case growth rate, CGR, it quantifies the changes in the number of new confirmed cases. Here we use the difference between the log value of the new confirmed cases. A larger CGR means a faster growth in the number of new confirmed cases. So all these metrics we will use later in our analysis. So this is the global mobility analysis result. We compare the mobility flow in January and April 2020, and we observe a considerable reduction of international travel and domestic travel across most of the countries all over the world. And we take two different countries and to make detailed analysis, the US and India. We choose the two countries due to their size, the population density, the epidemiological context, and difference in how policies are being implemented. And also, since both countries started the implementing social distancing measures at a very similar times. From the result, we observe 74% and 87% inter-country flow reduction for the US and India respectively. And the average intra-country flow reductions for the US and India, 39% and 72% respectively. So we just see a considerable reduction here. And next we look at the analysis in US. Here's the temporal analysis. The spaghetti plot shows the weekly FRR of states in the US. The vertical dashed line present the government orders, includes stay-at-home order, school closure, and emergency declaration. The government orders in different states may overlap with each other. So we can observe that there is a 41% mobility reduction compared to the pre-pandemic flows across the states just during the week here, where when most of the states have declared the stay-at-home orders. And also there is a 17% reduction in flows during the week of the first school closure order here. And also the 19% flow reduction in the week of the first stay-at-home order, which is this week. So the relative timing of the reduction of inflows indicates that the population complied to the social distancing guidelines and reduced the mobility just before the stay-at-home orders. And we compute the Pearson correlation between the county level outflows and new confirmed cases, which shows the moderate to high absolute correlation coefficients. And this indicates that concurrent with the rising number of new confirmed cases, there was a drop in mobility flow. And here we select 5 states with the largest number of confirmed cases in the US. The upper plot presents the timeline of mobility flow and new confirmed cases. The lower plot shows weekly FRR and CGR. And we observe that with the mobility dropping, although the number of new confirmed cases increased, the growth rate of the cases drop, we can see here. And despite rebound in mobility flow across all the states, that we observe that the CGR is not increasing. And so these plots show the spatial distribution of new confirmed cases, the FRR, and interstate flow matrix in 3 selected weeks. And generally, we can observe that the states with a higher number of cases have a higher reduction in flow. And there's a considerable reduction in flows across the US, and also the interstate mobility dropped about 70%, just compared before the pre-pandemic and after pandemic, the post-pandemic period. So we did the SDI analysis for the counties in the US. And box plot here shows weekly SDI at the county level. And we observe that the SDI is nearly a constant value until the implementation of national emergency and state level orders, after which we start to observe an increase in SDI. And the red plots, we select 5 states and shows the counties in the map. And we observe the overall shading moving towards yellow, indicating the reduction in mixing within counties. And also we conduct similar analysis for India. The overall observations are consistent with the observation in the US, but with a much higher reduction in flows, which is 68% for India, compared with the 41% in the US. So this is due to the strict curfew lockdown on March 22nd in India. And also we conduct the interstate mobility analysis, the SDI analysis. The results show that the SDI close to 1, indicating very little mixing after lockdown, and also a 70% reduction in the interstate mobility, which is quite similar to that for the US. And we analyze the migration pattern for India using the Jacob index, the number of edge removed and the number of edge added along the weeks. We can observe that during the week of lockdown, there is a sharp dip in the Jacob index and a maximum number of edge being removed and a minimum number of edge being added. All this shows that, which is consistent with observation, that there is flow reduction just because of the lockdown order. And also, we can also observe that just we do not reveal any mass migration of the population at and during the lockdown time. This can be potentially due to the relative flow volumes needed to maintain differential privacy and ownership bias in the Google mobility dataset. So this is one of the limitations in our work. So next, we simulate and compare the effect of a delayed intervention using a compartmental SER model. So for the normal scenario, we calibrate a weekly REFF using simulation optimization to match the new confirmed cases per 100,000 at the state and the country level. And for delayed scenarios, we extend the REFF schedule by persisting the REFF value in the normal scenario for 1 or more weeks and mirror the normal schedule with a 1 or more week delay. Here's the result for the US. We observe that the result indicates that a delay in implementation of intervention by 1 week would have led to 2.2 million additional cases as of May 30. And if the intervention had been postponed by 2 weeks, then the number of additional cases would have been to 6.2 million, which is almost 4.4 times the ground truth. So for India, a 1 week delay in imposition of lockdown would have led to 150,000 additional cases, while a 2 week delay would have resulted in 410,000 additional cases. So the analysis showed that a week delay would have doubled the reported number of cases in the US and India. And all the results confirm the importance of the timely lockdown in both countries. And there's still some limitations in our work, which include the discrepancy in testing. This will result in an undercount of the actual number of cases. And also the Google data may be representative of the population, and the representativeness can vary by location. So this is the limitation of the device ownership bias. And finally, that a decrease in aggregate mobility does not provide precise estimates in the decrease in social interactions. So we may need some other digital trace data set to estimate the social interactions precisely. This is our work, and we want to thank all the people and thank our institute and Google group to welcome any questions.
Thank you, Lijing. Great talk. We have two wonderful talks. So folks, please go ahead and ask questions.
Madhav, I have a question.
Yes, please, Ramana.
Yeah. So very, very interesting analysis. And I think this is a really nice way to go about it. Obviously, the limitations are there. Now, how much can we correct for bias in the mobility data because of ownership of mobile phones and so forth, or smartphones that may be representative? I think you've said that, but question is, are we talking about, the migrant population is the one that is doing all this interstate migration. They are not likely to get picked up by this diverse device ownership because a lot of them have very cheap phones or feature phones don't necessarily log into Google at all. And the people who were transmitting, where much of the transmission happening was in the urban areas, people have traveled abroad, especially in those first early phases. So are we talking about completely different groups of people? So it's hard to sort of attribute the effect, which is really in one group, from a variation in movement of a different group. But I mean, that's just for you guys to add in your discussion. I think let's just think of it like a review or comment. But
I think it's a perfect comment, Raman. I think this remains somewhat open. Google is very touchy about precisely telling, the demographic groups and such, as you can imagine, for various reasons. Now, for the migrant population, the analysis revealed, at least initially, we didn't see. Now, the results were stopped at some point, I think around, I don't remember the date. It's almost 15, 20 days now. But after the date that we decided to stop doing the calculation, and after the train started running, Ramanan, we did see a spike in the numbers. So you would know better how many of them carried phones, but we could see a very clear trend towards movement of people leaving the metropolitan areas. And hopefully maybe in the next couple of weeks, we might be able to provide you some data. We would love to hear your input at that point of time, if it's okay with you.
Absolutely. You might be able to get public train data. That, there were only a limited number of these migrant returning trains for a while. And I think the schedules for those, I don't know if you can retrieve from a cache somewhere, but it wasn't like the migrant movement was happening in an uncontrolled fashion. It was highly controlled. And that's why it didn't go so well. But you might be able to get that train data to match with the Google mobility data at least correctly.
That would be good. And that would actually serve as some weak form of validation, because roughly how packed the trains were, roughly speaking. And
No, the trains were all packed, but there were only limited number of trains. So only, I think on any given day, there are like 10,000 trains in India, and there were only like 200 trains for that period. So
right.
You can assume they were packed, but there were only limited number of trains, and they all tell you where they started and where they ended, because they're all single start, single end kind of places.
Right. So I think that would be very useful. That's a good suggestion. Some others had suggested too. I'll tell you one other limitation the data has. The data is based on these pings. So the notion of a trip is very hard to discern from this. You'll get, say, Madhav traveling from Delhi to Kanpur to Lucknow. I don't remember the order, but then to, Murshidabad and then forward. But you won't get this particular thing, because the notion of dwell time becomes an important portion of the story. So we'll have to do some tricks to essentially stitch together a path that the person might take, because it's aggregated at each 5 square kilometer block level, right? You get a sense of flows. So that's one limitation this data has. Google, of course, my guess is they have much more data, but they are very reluctant. Even this one was very, very hard to get hold of. I'm hoping that this would prove useful. I think one of the strengths on the flip side is that modulo China and a few other places, I think the coverage that Google has is probably among the best in the world in terms of devices. So at least at a global level, this data might serve as a good data set for us to do analysis.
Actually, Madhav, the other thing I would add is that I didn't understand that from the presentation, or maybe I missed that slide. I think the pairwise connections are particularly important because, interestingly, the case reporting out of UP and Bihar, which is the destination for most of these migrant trains, has not really gone up a whole lot. I mean, you're trying to correlate one thing to the other, but the lockdown measured through the migration is not necessarily the best proxy unless you have actually parameterized that growth function to the destination states, which is where you'd expect to see the biggest rise in cases. I imagine that's possible, right?
So this particular thing the runs were done at much more aggregate level. The role of migration, at least during the time we selected, was relatively small, Ramanan. So, but yes, I think that's a good idea. We can take it offline and talk more about it as well.
Sure, and we may have some data to match with what you have to do a better job. We've compiled state-level testing data and all very carefully, so you should be able to correct for some amount of the test-related bias as well.
Yeah. Okay, great. Lijing, thanks again. It was wonderful.
Okay, thank you.
Jacob, thanks as well.
If there's no more questions, just wanted to say thank you again to Jacob and Lijing for presenting today. And thanks everybody for coming.